So good evening, everyone. We are about to get off again on Ethiopia, African leadership, and as it says, investigating historic models of nation building in Africa. So we're going to look at Ethiopia. As you've seen from previous weeks, I spend most of the time talking about the modern country. We talk about a bit about the history of the country, a little bit about the the colonial struggle. Now, Ethiopia is unique, so you're going to have a unique one on this one because they've never been colonized. So it's slightly different when I do a little bit about history, and we spend most of the time talking about the more recent period. We normally do the post-colonial period, but there is no post-colonial period. So it'd be more or less 20th century, and then mainly we're going to talk about the modern times. What's the current situation from a leadership point of view in Ethiopia right now? So I'll share my screen, the full-size screen now. So it should come up full-size screen. Right, and we're good to go. What we cover every week, as you see, I always do this, the reflections on good leadership, the post-independent nation building. As I said, there isn't a post-independent because Ethiopia, really you have a kind of the period of Haile Selassie, which was the last emperor, and the post Haile Selassie period, and then the very most recent period. So we're going to go right up to date to the most current prime minister. So you're in for a bit of a treat there. Of course, I'm going to give about developing peace and prosperity for the country, as I always do. And there's been wars and different things in Ethiopia, even though they haven't had the colonial, they only had one little period of invasion. We will talk about the analysis of the political situation and its macroeconomic performance. I've got quite a bit of information on that, so that should be interesting, especially in the current situation. Their moral and development ideologies, and we'll talk about nation building, their policies and actions and so on, and whether it's disastrous or successful in Africa. So we'll cover all of that. Excuse me. Sorry, unavoidable sneeze. How we can promote, and also all the lessons, so how we can promote strong African-centered leadership and culture in Britain. So, reflections on good leadership. We use this Mo Ibrahim Prize for African Leadership as a little bit of an introduction. But as I always mention, this is basically around leaders who have left office. So the prize only goes to leaders who are in power and have retired or been lost an election. So anybody who's currently in power can't get this prize because it's only for former leaders. So it's something good to look at, but it's not enough. So are they role models? What sort of sustainable and equitable prosperity do they have for their people? Do they take issues around the continent as a whole? What else can we put? And so this is my additional reflections. Another perspective, which is, are they honest or corrupt? Which is quite interesting. I'm not going to spend too much time on that today because it's not the major focus of what's happening in Ethiopia, but it is relevant in another sense. So I'll come back to that. Deliver clear social progress, and including on women. I've got some slides specifically on women in Ethiopia because that's quite also interesting. So you look forward to that as well. Have they left a strong economy? So we've got different people. We had pre-Haile Selassie. We've got post-Haile Selassie when we had what's described commonly as a Marxist dictator. Take what you want with that one, but that's the language they use. And then we've had the sort of election period where they had sort of free and open elections, even though free and open elections is a question mark in Ethiopia. Still a history of repression. And then the most recent prime minister who came to power in 2018. So the last 2 years are very relevant. So I'm going to cover all of that. What sort of institutions have they left? Not a massive amount on that, but we'll cover a little bit of that as well. Have they got any Pan-African policy direction? We'll touch a little bit about East African integration as well. And succession planning has been a problem in Ethiopia, but we'll come to that. So we did week 1, Tanzania, South Africa. We did week 2, Ghana. Week 3, Zimbabwe. Last week, we did Rwanda. And this week, we're doing Ethiopia. So the World Happiness Index, as I said, I'm not convinced about it, but it's just an indicator. So the numbers on the right is where they are in the world. So there's about, I think, just under 200 countries on this list. So I'm quite surprised at where they rate these countries. Because when you hear about, you all heard about Rwanda last week, and then compare it to Ethiopia this week, you'd be surprised that the happiness index is so much better in Ethiopia. But anyway, it's interesting. And then, of course, next week, And we're going to do Botswana, and then the last one, South Sudan. Okay, so let's just look at some context here. African, we'll look at Africa as a whole. Just a quick thing on the Millennium Development Goals in Africa. And then we have African Union made a decision in Libya in 2005 to adopt some of these for Africa. So this is just some of the results. So Africa has made progress, particularly in primary education, particularly on gender equality, and tackling incidents of malaria and HIV and AIDS. So there's some positive stories in Africa just as a whole. And the annual rate of reduction of under 5 mortality is was improving faster than many other places in the world. And you know, what we've done around mosquitoes and the whole thing about malaria has been really good. So there's some success stories. Right, so let's go on to the topic for this evening. Right, so official name. Lots of countries are not called by their official name most of the time. So most people won't say the Federal Democratic Republic of Ethiopia, but it is a republic. And that is significant because when Haile Selassie was in power, the last emperor, it wouldn't have been called a republic. Okay, it would have been called Ethiopia, but it wouldn't have been called a republic. So a democratic republic normally means you replace the monarchy with a election system and you know, you know, people who are not basically there because of their birth. So East African country of about 110 million people. It is in the east. Some people get confused. If you look at this carefully, Ethiopia is actually landlocked. A lot of people don't think it is, because when you see it on a map from a distance, it looks like Ethiopia is on the coast. But when you look carefully, Eritrea is actually on the coast. Djibouti is on the coast. Somalia is on the coast. But Ethiopia is actually landlocked. So it is actually a landlocked country. And that is an issue with the local area. And there's some issues I'll raise later. Not major things, but there are some issues, particularly on the Sudan border as well. So it can be a significant issue when you're a landlocked country, because to get trade and to get access to, you know, sea traffic, which is a major way that goods and services are moved around the world. And that path through the Suez Canal that just goes up to Egypt is a major gateway from Asia through to Europe. So it is actually Ethiopia strategically very, very close to the coast, but they've got to go through Eritrea, Djibouti or Somalia to ship anything or to fly. They've got to fly over as well. So it is a landlocked country. And in the context of Africa, it's easier to see on a map when you see the whole of Africa. So it's definitely firmly on the east. And we talked about last week where we talked about here, you see Kenya on to the south and Sudan. And you've got, of course, these other countries. So very close to Rwanda, etc., what we mentioned last week. This is really important as well. Almost 50% of Ethiopia's population is under 18. So it's a very young country. If you contrast that to countries like Japan, who with a similar population size, has a very much higher older age group. So therefore it's an aging population, because Japan's population is being under stress because there's not enough children being born. Less women on average are having 2 children, so they're not replacing themselves and their partner. So that the Japanese population is actually got potential to shrink dramatically over the next 20 years, and that could have a dramatic impact on their population. On the other side, if you've got a very young population, you've also got a lot of stresses, because if 50% are under 18, that means they're not earning. They're not productive as in economic earners. Now, we know that children in Africa can earn, but on a whole, they're not going to earn much. So 50% of your population is not earning. They have to be looked after. So the other 50%, which includes old people, includes people who are not working, have to look after the 50% who are dependent, almost totally dependent on their parents. So that does put certain burdens on society and create certain pressures. So that adds to the stress on Ethiopia as a nation. Let's look a bit about Ethiopian history. I'm not going to go too long on this, but I just want to give a bit of context, because Ethiopia is very, very significant for us as African people. The oldest human remains discovered to date is in Ethiopia. So the oldest person in the world, the first human beings, came from Ethiopia. So it's very, very important. Look how old Ethiopia is. There's many countries in the world that are like, look at South Sudan, is a recently named country. Of course, the place existed, but very new. There's some places didn't exist 4 million years ago. There probably was nobody actually living there. So it just goes to show the significance of Ethiopia. It has the oldest, it's Africa's oldest independent country, because, as I said, it was never colonized. It is the home of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, one of the oldest Christian denominations in the world. Of course, Africa gave Christianity to the world. You can, again, anything I say you can challenge, you can look it up yourself, but it certainly did. So when you see Christianity came out of Africa, the concepts and the ideas behind it. So the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, people see in Africa, in America, some of these churches, and also African Orthodox churches as well. And that's where it, you know, it's very, very strong history. Apart from 5 years of occupation by Mussolini's Mussolini was an Italian dictator, basically. So when Mussolini was in power, he thought he got arrogant enough to think he could colonize Ethiopia, because again, Italy is one of those countries in Europe that didn't get their share of Africa. So there was a 5-year occupation, but it never colonized Ethiopia. So Ethiopia has never been colonized. It has a unique cultural heritage. You might see certain things that you are quite classic about Ethiopia. Of course, the culture, even the look of the people, because one of the things that's interesting, there's a stereotype of, in places like Britain, of what an African looks like. But actually, if you look at Ethiopians can look very different to a West African. So for example, the features, much more slimmer features, much straighter hair. A lot of people, we talk about natural hair, but you can have natural hair as an Ethiopian and be quite straight, much straighter hair than you would have if you was in West Africa, for example, but you're still African. Still can be very dark, and some people can be much lighter. So Africa is full of contrast. Doesn't make you not African because you don't have certain features. So we have to be careful when you say, what does an African look like? Because in East Africa, people's features can be quite significantly different to people in West Africa. And people in England, we tend to not have as many people on East Africa living in England, apart from Kenyans. But lots of other parts of East Africa are not necessarily in high numbers in this country. So Emperor Haile Selassie, I'm going to give a bit more details on that later. Some people do not realize that Emperor Haile Selassie and Rastafari and the whole modern religion or movement, what different people describe it in different ways. It comes from the Emperor Haile Selassie, because when Marcus Garvey was very dominant in the 1930s, in the 1920s, he said we should look to Africa. And he said very commonly, who is our leader? Who is our king of kings? Who is our queen of queens? And he used this kind of language. And so when the Emperor Haile Selassie came into power and it was heard about in places like Jamaica, they said this was the coming of our king. This is the African king. And that's kind of a little bit, in a very simplistic way, the history of Rastafari and Rai. The Rastafari movement came from Rastafari. And when Emperor Haile Selassie came to the throne, he had locks. A lot of people don't know that. He had locks. And when he came to the throne, his locks was cut off ceremony, in part of the ceremony. But of course, we didn't have social media. We didn't have video and all that in those days. So you'd have to look at certain images of the emperor to see that he had locks. But most of the modern images of him were when he was in power, when he didn't have locks. So the association is not clear. But that we have to make that historical link. So there is a lot of history and connection and emotion with the Rastafari movement. And many Rastas have moved to Ethiopia to go and live in Ethiopia and see it as a historical, a very significant home to the Rastafari movement. So very, very important to people. And actually, that's wrong. Sorry, I'll take that. That shouldn't be in there. I'll come back to that later. Yeah, that's something that comes from somebody else. But anyway, I'm sorry about that. Selassie was the last emperor of Ethiopia, and he ended the over 3,000-year Ethiopian monarchy. So the monarchy in Ethiopia is longer than the monarchy in Britain. And some people have seen a famous image where when the Queen of England, Elizabeth II, visited Ethiopia and met Haile Selassie, she bowed to him. A lot of people think that's a very, very significant image, because the Queen, I don't believe, bows to anybody else in the world, has ever bowed to anybody. But the Queen of England bowed to the Emperor Haile Selassie, and that's very significant because the Queen knows her history and the significance of the royal family, the oldest royal family in the world in Ethiopia. So some people, if you can Google that, you'll find the picture, and it's a very powerful image that is of that image. Okay. Right, let's have a look at a little bit more recent politics, which is starting with around that period. What happened? So Haile Selassie came to power in 1930. As I said, he came to the throne. So he was an emperor. Okay, so he was there because of birth, which some people believe in Republican politics. People like me don't believe that people should rule over anybody else just because of who your father was or your mother was. We see this as a nonsense, really. But anyway, Haile Selassie did exist, and he was an emperor. And he did some reforms, and some things he did quite positively. But his relationship with Eritrea has created a whole history of antagonism that has created a lot of problems up until the most recent prime minister has had peace with Eritrea. So it's a constant. This has been a constant issue of that whole issue. So he created this federation of Eritrea and basically took over the control of Eritrea. He later dissolved that in 1962. So you think that was 32 years after he was in power. And then he annexed Eritrea, occupying them, which created the war of independence for the Eritrean people. So the Eritrean people fought a war against Ethiopia for many, many years, causing lots of people to die. Haile Selassie did play a significant role in the formation of the OAU. Now, if you know your history, you know that Kwame Nkrumah was instrumental in trying to bring together Africa, as you knew when I did Ghana. And what was so significant was that back in 1957, when Nkrumah came to power independent Ghana in 1957, he brought together the then 8 African leaders and who were independent and brought them together for the first time to talk about African unity and integration. And basically they started the African Freedom Day. And then in April, African Freedom Day in April 1957. And then later in 1963, they changed it from African Freedom Day to African Liberation Day, which was the 25th of May, 1963. And the reason why they moved it to the 25th of May is because that was the day that Africa formed the Organization of African Unity. So, and it was in Addis Ababa, the capital of Ethiopia, that was formed. So that's why Haile Selassie was seen as, he was a very big champion of the Organization of African Unity, and he did champion Africa during that time. His rule was ended on the 12th of September 1974. So he ruled from 1930 for basically 44 years, uncontested, or you can say it was contested, but basically he was the ruler for 44 years as the emperor of Ethiopia. And he did bring in some institutional reforms and, you know, like legal systems and all those kind of structures with the public sector, you know, civil servants and all that. But then he was overthrown by the Derg, is the name of the organization. And it was a Soviet-backed, who they claimed to be Marxist-Leninist organization. And effectively it was a military dictatorship led by what is commonly known as Mengistu, Haile Mariam, but is well known as Mengistu. And that period of Mengistu from 1974 to 1995 was seen as quite a repressive period in Ethiopia's history, that 20 years of repression and significant levels of repression after that as well. Many people describe Haile Selassie, by the way, as a feudal lord and not that progressive in terms of rights of women, you know, rights of minorities, rights of the people, and the fact that he didn't bring an administration so the people could rule. It was an undemocratic country because basically he ruled as the emperor, like a king. So, you know, lots of people say that's not progressive, and it's not effectively progressive, is it? And from 1977 to 78, look at the amount of people who were killed. So again, this was described as a military dictatorship by many and quite repressive government, where 500,000 of its own people were killed, and it was called, as a result of what they called Red Terror. They called it the Red Terror, the behavior of this government. And forced deportations, you know, throwing people out the country and using hunger as a weapon, people literally starving people out to get them to submit to your power and your rule. So not a very pleasant government, that whole government at that time. And it had the support of the Soviet Union because it gave the rhetoric of Marxist-Leninism as its ideology and said it was a socialist government and progressive and revolutionary. So if you understand history, you'd understand that most people to the left, so-called Marxist-Leninists, so-called socialists, are generally against monarchies. And generally most countries have fought against their monarchy and replaced the monarchy with democracy. So in many countries, they were overthrown and some killed, like in places like the Soviet Union, in France, and places like that. But in many other countries, what has happened is they didn't kill them. They allowed them to keep their titles and maybe a little bit of land and a little bit of wealth, but didn't kill them, allowed them to stay with the name and become ceremonial, a bit like the Queen of England. The Queen of England has no, well, I shouldn't say has no power. She still has some power. She has influence and she has some power in signing laws and so on like that, but she can't really say no. Constitutionally, the Queen couldn't really say no. It'd be a crisis if the Queen ever said no to signing any legislation. So basically, this country is ruled by a prime minister and a cabinet and a political party, and the Queen just basically does whatever the prime minister says, and they have their private conversations once a week that we don't know what they talk about. So that's the context you have to understand. So most left-wing organizations, so if you're a Marxist-Leninist political organization, you would want to overthrow the government of, well, it's not a government, but the emperor of Ethiopia, because you see the emperor as an oppressive force and it should be replaced by the people. So that's the context there. The famous famine, you know, you had Live Aid and all that stuff, that Ethiopia became, unfortunately, famously known for famine. And Ethiopia, one of the most symbolic places when I was young, in the 1980s, as a young person growing up, I saw Ethiopia as one of those sad places where flies on their faces and, you know, all that image of Africa that haunts many of us, that those of us who don't know Africa, we saw those images on the TV and it was like, oh, just, why would one associate with something that was seen as so negative? You know, all the, and even today we still have that, where you have adverts and charities that make Africa look so negative, because most people, if you're non-African and you haven't been to countries like certain places in Africa, like Gambia, South Africa, there's certain places that are very touristic, but even then you don't see the, what I call the real Africa, because people go on, you know, safaris and things like that. They don't really know the real, what I call the real Africa. So people's perception of Africa is mainly what they see on TV, and what you see on TV in those days wasn't films like Bollywood, sorry, like Nollywood and stuff like that, like the Nigerian films and African films you get today, and stars and all that, footballers and all that. You didn't have any of that then. All you had is images of Africans being very poor, because the only image of Africa was all the adverts that basically Eurocentric or Western charities and NGOs used to put on the TV and in newspaper form, in adverts, showing these poor Africans who need help. So the overall perception of Africa is very negative. So this whole famine in Africa, in Ethiopia, damaged the image of Ethiopia tremendously around the world. So that image of Ethiopia has remained a very strong image, that when you mention Ethiopia to many people, they think, oh, that country that had the famines and they couldn't feed themselves. And if you look, 8 million people were affected and 1 million people died as a result of the famine. So again, if you look at this in abstract, you don't really look at leadership, but actually, is it a failure of leadership if your people starve? It must be. You can't rule a country for you have 3,000 years of rule. And after 3,000 years, you can't feed your own people. There's something wrong there somewhere, isn't it? Because you can't say, well, it was all the white man's fault, it was all colonialism, because Ethiopia was never colonized. But we have to be careful with that. Whilst Ethiopia was never colonized, Ethiopia still would have suffered the structural isolation of being part of Africa and a country that was a continent that was devastated by colonialism. So whilst Ethiopia wasn't directly colonized, because everybody around them was colonized and it's a landlocked country, Ethiopia would have still had the same problems of the perception of Africa, the difficulty to trade. Ethiopia wouldn't have had easy partners to trade with in Africa because it was all colonized. So you didn't have immediate friends. So Ethiopia suffered from development in a very similar way, because the traditional links and trade links around the whole of Africa were damaged by colonialism, because the seas and the whole continent was controlled by colonizers. Okay, so Ethiopia would have suffered from a structural relationship with the rest of Africa, even though it wasn't directly colonized. Also, of course, with what happened in Ethiopia, it led to, and what with the annexation of Eritrea and the Tigrayan people, it led to a liberation struggle, because the Tigrayan people and the Eritrean people then fought a war of liberation against Ethiopia. And this war has been plaguing the region for too long, until the most current prime minister ended it. And I'll come back to that shortly. Sorry, I don't know why these are not in order. I must have changed the slide around. Sorry about this. So let's look at some context here. I'm going to put these all up because they're not in order. So I think I played around with them a little bit. So the Tigrayan People's Liberation Front, TPLF, merged with the ethnically-based opposition movements back in 1989, and they formed the Ethiopian People's Revolutionary Development, the Democratic Front, which is still the government today, the EPRDF, okay, which was the government for most of the period from after the so-called military dictatorship. But these organizations did later become the government. So it's interesting to see what happened. One of the problems here as well with leadership is, one of the things we should be very critical of is ethnically based political parties and movements. This is predominantly negative, sectarian, and damaging Africa. So in other words, if you form a political party based on your ethnic group, by its very nature, it's divisive. Because if you only want to be part of my political organization if you're my ethnic group, what happens to people who are not in my ethnic group? And when I get to power, what is my position? Am I going to just look after my own ethnic group? How does that work with other people? And does that mean that large parts of your society are completely removed? Imagine if you had, Wales, the Welsh Party, and you actually do have nationalist parties here. You have the Scottish Nationalist Party, you have the Welsh Nationalist Plaid Cymru, and you have Sinn Féin in Ireland, nationalist parties in England. You have the National, you had the National Front, you had the EPLF, and these English, what was it, the English Defence League, the EDF, these are nationalist parties. And do people feel united with these parties now? But some of them, like the Scottish Nationalist Party, doesn't say it's got anything to do with England. It says, we just want to rule our own country called Scotland. Plaid Cymru, Nationalist Party in Wales, says they just want to rule Wales. Sinn Féin doesn't even take their seats because they don't recognise the British state. They don't even take their seats as MPs. They say they only want to rule their own country called Ireland. So it's different to have ethnic-based, well, I wouldn't even call them ethnic-based, they're nationalist organisations, because Plaid Cymru is not ethnically based. It's not based on the ethnicity of individual groups of Welsh people. The Scottish Nationalist Party isn't either. These unite the whole country. So any Scottish person can be part of the Scottish Nationalist Party. Any Welsh person can be part of Plaid Cymru. Any Irish person can be part of Sinn Féin. So it's a device. It's not divisive in that sense. And similarly, in the opposite way, if you're in the National Front, you're not going to want black people to be part of the organization. So by very nature of being ethnically based, it's racist. So any ethnically based political party in Africa is by definition divisive and not positive. So politics based on ethnicity is a very divisive in Africa and not a positive thing. I'm glad to see more people have joined as well. So pleased to see you on the call. So the Soviet Union, now problems came because, as I said before, you had a Marxist-Leninist government in power in Ethiopia. Now, if you know about the history of the Cold War between sort of the 1945 right up to the collapse of the Soviet Union back in around 1991, the world was largely polarized between those who support America and the West and were in alliance with them, and those who were in alliance with the Soviet Union, and those who were non-aligned movement. You also had the non-aligned movement, but largely most political parties in that period of time aligned themselves with one force or the other. They were either pro-Western or pro-Soviet Union. So, but that created problems for Ethiopia, because then when the Soviet Union collapsed, it stopped giving aid to Ethiopia in 1990. That created economic hardship because Ethiopia had aligned itself with the Soviet Union. Therefore, it had a hostile relationship with the West and a hostile relationship with some of its neighbors. So when the collapse of the Soviet Union, it meant that there was a real problem. And if you see the EPRDF forces advanced on Addis Ababa in May 91, no surprise, it was around the time when the Soviet Union pulled out, because then the Soviet Union wasn't also providing military assistance to this government. So therefore it was easier for the EPRDF to overthrow Mengistu's government and replace it with something else. So they overthrew Mengistu basically, and Mengistu fled the country and got asylum in Zimbabwe. Now there's a question. Should Zimbabwe have taken Mengistu as a political prisoner? Now some people will say, no, he's a bad guy. He should have been tried for war crimes. Why did he go to Zimbabwe? Now there's another way of looking at it, that sometimes leaders won't leave a country if they're going to be killed or they're going to be prosecuted. So sometimes if you don't give them sanctuary somewhere, it makes it harder for the country to move forward. So sometimes it might not seem positive to allow a leader who has blood on their hands to leave the country and go in exile. If they don't, it could be a bloodbath trying to get rid of them, because if they know you're going to arrest them as soon as they leave power, of course they won't want to leave power. So you have a problem. So these are real moral dilemmas with leadership, and there's no perfect answer. You have to decide what's best for your country and your opinion on these things. But anyway, he was still tried anyway, because the Ethiopian Federal High Court in Addis Ababa found Mengistu and his leaders guilty of genocide in their absence. Absentia just means that they tried them even though they're not physically there to be tried. They still tried them, and they found them guilty of genocide to their own people. So by July 91, the EPRDF convened a national conference to establish a transitional government in Ethiopia, and they decided that they would try and have a new constitution and remodel the country to have democratic institutions and democratic rule. So let's go to that period. So by 1994, there was a new constitution written that established a parliamentary republic with a bicameral legislature and judicial system, which basically means an upper and lower house. Bi means two, and upper and lower house is what you have in Britain, where you have the upper house of Lords and you have the lower house of Commons, even though it's a bit confusing because just like in America, you have the upper house and the lower house, but actually it's kind of a little bit of a complicated relationship between the two. If you don't know it, I won't go into bore you with the details right now. But basically, the sort of parliament that you would expect to see in most countries around the world was developed in 1994. So of course they went on to have an election. So Ethiopia had a general elections, and they've had general elections every 5 years since 95. So it has remained a democracy, and so therefore there hasn't been, this to and fro and coups d'etats and so on and so on. But there has been political repression, though, during that time. But by the time 2015 came, there was not a single opposition MP elected. So these are the kind of, gives you the context of the country. You can see how it's divided. The opposition are isolated. But what also happened is the political party that I mentioned, that was the coalition between the Eritreans and the Tigrayans, which is also part of the Ethiopian. This is what creates confusion when you have these ethnic groups. So you have Ethiopian political party, but it's brought together by a whole coalition of these different so-called ethnic groups. So it creates a bit of confusion when you hear that. But basically these political parties were non-sectarian, so they weren't just ethnically based anymore, and they took power. And because it was a broad coalition of forces, that the opposition became more and more marginalized, and that's why they ended up with no MPs and boycotted the election. You have the typical things that happen so often. So the 2015 election was kind of seen as controversial, which is the most recent election, by the way, because there's supposed to be an election this year, but I think because of COVID-19, there's going to be, I think there's a bit of a delay around it, which is also controversial, because if you delay an election, it's seen as a little bit of manipulation. So 1995, the election was won by the EPRDF, which was the party that took power over Mengistu and the political party that formed the new constitution. No surprise that they won the election. And its leader at that time was a guy called Zenawi, okay? And Zenawi was seen as a darling of the West for many, many years because he brought in lots of reforms and so on. So he became the first prime minister of the Federal Democratic Republic of Ethiopia in 1995. So that's the first time that they actually formally got rid of the monarchy and that whole concept. Now, this border dispute, as I told you before, I'm missing out bits of history so we don't get too bogged down with that part of the history, just for the sake of time. But Ethiopia has had a long history of this conflict with Ethiopia. Over what? You see, when you have a land dispute, if you look at the size, when I showed you the slide on Ethiopia, the size of Ethiopia compared to Eritrea is enormous. So why is Ethiopia having a war with Eritrea? I've always asked myself this same question. I cannot see what is the argument. Just let Eritrea have their land and stop the dispute, because it's not significant to Ethiopia. And they've had wars and fights and economic turmoil all over what? And this is one of the other weaknesses in African politics and world politics. Egos, often male, big egos can get in the way of peace. Because what are you fighting over in the end of the day? It's a bit like when You see people fighting in the playground over a part of, you know, people fighting over Tottenham versus Haringey, sorry, Tottenham versus Hackney, or, you know, different parts of London. You know, you're not in my manor and all that nonsense. You know, all this postcode wars and trouble. It's nonsense. People see it as a total nonsense. What are you fighting over? A piece of pavement, a piece of nothing. It's just not significant. So why would you lose your life over that? But in Africa, it's on another level. It's the same thing you have in other parts of the world as well. You have it in the Middle East, you have it in Africa, you've had it in Europe. So it's not unique to Africa, but fighting over little pieces of land that are not that significant becomes an ego issue in the end. If the bigger party just said to the smaller party, you can have it, it's not going to make any difference to us, just have it. It would be so much easier to have peace. And it proved to be the point, because in 2018, that's exactly what happened. So there's the border dispute, more war, more fighting, more disputes. And when you're having war, you're wasting resources on military, you're wasting resources that could be used for developing the country. And you've also got a hostile neighbor that you're at war with. So you're not trading with them. And the only way Ethiopia can get its resources is through Eritrea, Djibouti, or through Somalia. So if you're having war with your neighbor, now you're having problems with goods and services, you're just creating a lot of headache for yourself. Over what? Because in the end, what did Ethiopia get out of this war apart from hardship? So it's just a pointless war and a bad example of leadership. So 2010, the disputed election was another, well, all these disputed election, because the election was stopped. This was worse than the 2015 one. So in 2010, this is why it's controversial. So you have an election in 2010. It looked like the EPRDF wasn't going to win. So they just stopped the election and put themselves into power. So this is what created all the opposition and the resistance to the government, because they're seen as not legitimate. See, any leader who looks like they're going to lose and then cancels the election is not legitimate. It's not seen as legitimate. Same thing happened in, I think it was Morocco or Algeria. In Algeria, when the French colluded with the existing rulers of Algeria, because it looked like Algeria was going to elect a progressive Muslim-based government. So with France's help, they just cancelled the elections, and it created a whole long period of war. Same problem we have in here. So this is why it's so important to have good leadership, because all these disputes, because people are fighting over a little bit of power, creates havoc in the country and chaos, and it doesn't help the country develop. So now he died unexpectedly in August 2012 in Brussels, where he was being given treatment for, we don't even know why. I don't know what he did. During that period, from 1995, so that's 5 years, 17 years. So over that 17-year period, he was seen by the West as quite a progressive leader in the sense of economic reforms. He wasn't seen as progressive in terms of human rights and in terms of women, but he was seen in terms of economic reforms, like trying to open up Ethiopia, trying to bring in a bit of investment, developing the infrastructure, and you know, encouraging business to thrive so Ethiopia could develop. And they did make some progress during that 17-year period. They had fantastic economic growth rates. So it really did make a difference. The famines, they got over the famines and got past the famine. So even though they can be criticizing of his human rights record and his position on women and, you know, not doing so well in education, health, etc., but certainly in terms of the economy as a whole, they did make a difference, and they were reducing poverty. So it's quite interesting to see that. His deputy prime minister, I won't even try and pronounce all of that, but Haile Mariam, he was appointed the prime minister on his death in 2012, and seen by many as not a very good leader. So 6 years later is when he resigned, which created the current prime minister. Most people have never heard of this guy. They can't remember him. He's not very memorable. Now, human rights abuses continued and the rise of political prisoners. So Ethiopia was a country that had hundreds and hundreds of political prisoners. And what we mean by political prisoners is people who were just jailed just because of their, politics. So you're not jailed because you broke a specific law. The only thing you were arrested for is just because we don't like your politics, because you're opposing our politics. Now, sometimes we have to be careful that there are people who actually openly say they want to topple the government. Now, no government can accept people openly saying they're going to topple you. So obviously that's going to become a crime. You know, if I said I wanted to topple the government of the Conservative government without a democratic election, if I kept on promoting that and trying to build a political party around it, I'll get arrested and, you know, it become a political problem, because I'm not just opposed to the government and saying I want to be elected. If I say I'm going to physically overthrow the government, no government can tolerate that. No matter what your political persuasion is, no government can do that. So you end up having some political prisoners based on that. But just being in jail because you criticize, you know, if you criticize Boris Johnson, or you criticize the Conservative government and they jail you because you criticize them, that's what you call a political prisoner. You know, or you write an article or you write a book saying that you disagree with, you know, sanctions, or you disagree their foreign policy, you disagree with their policy on COVID-19, you disagree with anything, and you get jailed for it, that's a political prisoner. And Ethiopia had hundreds and hundreds of political prisoners until very recently. There was a fairer distribution of wealth, and generated by over a decade, as I said, of economic growth. But this is all relative, because when we say a fairer redistribution of wealth, there wasn't much wealth to distribute and a very large number of people. So Ethiopia is still a very, very poor country. Ethiopia declared a state of emergency in 2016 because of the uprisings and the fight against them and all the different things that were going on. So that same prime minister, who was the deputy who became the prime minister, it was the first ruler in modern Ethiopian history to step down. So very, very unusual situation, because most leaders never step down if there's no election, right? Who gives up power when there's no election? Very few people ever do that. You know, Mandela, one of the few leaders in Africa to step down from power after his first 5 years and just said, I'm stepping down, I'll leave it to other people. Very few rulers ever step down. They end up getting overthrown, physically killed, or the people elect somebody else. Very few people actually give up power. There's not many examples, but there are some in Africa, but not too many. So economic growth. Let's have a look at some of the economic growth situation here, because it's very worth mentioning. The war with Eritrea ended around this period of time, so that was significant. The dispute continued, but a formal war was ended into around 2000. So that, as I told you, if you have a war with your neighbor, it's going to create economic problems. If Britain was at war with Scotland, or with war with Wales, it's going to waste resources, because it means you've got a hostile relationship with a next door neighbor, means that there's going to be economic problems, because who's going to want to travel from England to Scotland? If literally Scotland was at war with Britain, why would you travel? You wouldn't go on holiday to Scotland, would you, if they was at war with England, and the other way around? So you're going to reduce trade, and you're going to create tensions and problems. And what if you had to get your goods through Scotland to get your goods to market and to other parts of the world, and you're in a war with them? You can see how this is a major problem. So economic growth was excellent in Ethiopia, one of the fastest growing economies in the world. But remember, if you're very poor, even with a fast growing economy, it's going to take decades for you to really become a wealthier country. So even though Ethiopia has had very high levels of growth from 2000 right up to now, it's still very poor, but better than it was. So it's still a good story. And that's a good part of leadership that I would praise in Ethiopia, that they have grown the economy, and they are helping generate more jobs for people. Some of the debt relief programs, because of the arguments that Africa gave and Ethiopia gave. So what we call debt relief is basically where you owe people like the World Bank and the IMF and Western countries, or nowadays China, and you ask for debt relief. And debt relief basically means, look, I owe you X amount of money. Is there a way you can give me better terms, delay the payments, give me a payment holiday, or cancel some of the debts? That helps people who are already poor, like countries who are poor, get themselves out of a crisis. Because if a lot of your budget is going to pay off debt, then of course you're not doing enough to help your own people. So there was 4 successive poverty alleviation programs. So there was real efforts to try and do that. They did improve agriculture and infrastructure from farm to market. See, if you live in a rural area and you don't have any decent roads, remember, most people don't have a car, they don't have a helicopter, they don't have anything like that. So if you're predominantly rural, like Ethiopia is, and most people are subsistence farmers, and subsistence farming just means you sell enough to survive. That's what subsistence means, is that you're not selling for a profit. You're not selling so you can buy a mansion or buy a car. You're selling just to survive. So you literally sell a few bananas, and that allows you just to have enough money to buy a little bit of rice. That's subsistence, right? You're just basically just surviving. So most people in places like Ethiopia are subsistence farmers. So improving your infrastructure so people can get their goods to market just opens up the door to the possibility of making more money and creates a little bit of incentive for people in rural areas to try and produce more than you need to survive, so you can make that extra money so the country can now benefit from the extra resources, etc. The government did have a growth model, and it was looking to industrialize the country. We talked about this under Ethiopia, under Nkrumah in Ghana, that one of the things we saw as progressive leadership and Nkrumah-ism is the idea that you must industrialize the country. So that we certainly think it's good leadership for Ethiopia to industrialize, because without industrialization in the modern world, you can't meet the demands of a modern country, especially with a population so large and with such a young population. See, without modern machinery and the power of, of specialization, which industry gives you, you can't produce, no country has done it, produced enough jobs for all the young people when there's so many young people in society. So it's really important to industrialize. More privately owned Ethiopian banks, because Ethiopia still protects its bank, which again, we would say is good leadership, that you don't just allow foreign banks to come in and control your economy. You say, no, in Ethiopia, the only banks are Ethiopian banks. You can't just bring Western banks in and just do whatever you like. They can only do privately owned Ethiopian banks, and that's promoted. They are starting to look at opening up the economy, but that's one thing that was protected, which we would also support. And millionaires doubled between 2007 and 2015. There was double the number of millionaires in Ethiopia. Now, you wouldn't think of Ethiopia as somewhere with a lot of millionaires. So nearly 3,000 millionaires in Ethiopia, and that was in 2015. There's probably more now, maybe more than 3,000, I don't know. So it's not something you'd associate with Ethiopia, or, real wealth. No foreign investment allowed in banks or telecoms, as I said before, right? So they wouldn't allow foreign investment into these particular sectors. They were protected, state-run. Attracting foreign investment for industrialization and manufacturing. So they did encourage and try to get some industrialization through foreign investment. And there's some real good success stories with that in Ethiopia. Some of them is a Chinese shoe company. Some of a massive producer of shoes in Ethiopia that employ, I think, 60,000 Ethiopians making shoes. And some of the shoes sold in America are made in Ethiopia. So you might be surprised at stuff like that. Coca-Cola, you're more familiar with. Heineken, Unilever have also invested in Ethiopia in terms of industrial plants, producing stuff for the local economy and the local marketplaces. Quite often though, Coca-Cola, Heineken and Unilever produce factories to be sold locally. So they're not necessarily doing it for your benefit. So just consider that as well. And also it's not necessarily positive to be selling, strong drink and fizzy drinks to a country, but it can create jobs and so on. Depends on your view about these things. Now, Ethiopia has built some huge industrial parks. Again, how many of us who are not Ethiopian would know about this success story where they've had huge industrial parks? And I'm talking mega sized, largest in sub-Saharan Africa, with the capacity to export $2 billion worth of goods. So that's a big industrial park. And Ethiopia are building 15 of these. So they really are investing in infrastructure. Now, this 10 years of growth has actually achieved some great things. Foreign direct investment has grown. It was only 100 million in 2008. So this is how poor the economy was left. Comes back to the period where you had the so-called Marxist-Leninist political people there. The country was poor with very little investment coming in from outside. 100 million investment up to 2 billion in investment. There's no comparison in terms of the amount of investment. Top 10, Ethiopia now the top 10 places for foreign direct investment in Africa, and seen as a very, very positive place to invest by Western countries and the world. It has got a mixed economy in transition with a large public sector. So Ethiopia still has state-owned companies, which they're increasingly looking to sell or have joint investors. So foreign investors can have 49% and the government or the Ethiopians can have 51%. So still having that little bit of control, okay? The government, as I said, is privatizing, having that mixed economy. The industrial sector has grown, and that's significant as well because the size of your industrial base is directly related to the wealth of the nation. If you look at places like Singapore, China, the size of the industrial base is huge. So that makes a big difference when you're trying to alleviate poverty. See, if you have a major agricultural sector, no country that I know of has moved itself out of massive poverty through agriculture. So many people who are quite emotional about Africa and say, oh, the number one priority in Africa is the land. No, the number one priority in Africa wouldn't be agricultural, as in agricultural land. It would be land to industrialize and to build real wealth, because the level of wealth you can create in a city or an industrial park is much, much higher than the same land size for agriculture. The amount of land you need to make billions from agriculture is you need huge amounts of land, huge amounts of labor, and takes years and years and years to make money out of it, unless you're making finished goods. You see, the profit in most economies around the world is not in the resource, it's in the finished goods. So one of the big mistakes we make in Africa when we say Africa has diamonds, it has gold, it has this, it has that, that's true. But Africa will never really appreciate our wealth if we don't make something with it. See, if you, all you do is just give the wealth away for peanuts, because if you sell cocoa, you sell gold, you sell diamonds that are raw and crude, you're going to get a much lower price than if it's been manufactured and it's been customized in some way. So a diamond ring is worth a lot more than a little diamond that is not formed in any way, because it's not worth as much as a diamond that's made and cut into something that looks beautiful that can be sold. So having cocoa, you might get a little price for cocoa, but you get a big price for chocolate. If you sell chocolate in Belgium, Belgium chocolate is sold at a premium price, but the cocoa is sold at a low price. So Africa gets a very small portion of the wealth, and the West gets a very big proportion of the wealth. So this is why industrialization is so important. So growing the industrial sector from 10 to 17% in 10 years is still good, but we want it to be higher than that. Reduce absolute poverty from 45% to 25%. So you see, we're still talking about huge numbers, because if you're saying absolute poverty, not poverty, absolute poverty is 25%, that's 25 million people, more than 25 million people. So it's still a lot of people live in absolute poverty in Ethiopia. So even though they've made great progress, so taken 20 million people out of absolute poverty, it's all relative. From absolute poverty to poverty is not a great story. It's good because it's the right direction. But if I moved you out of absolute poverty into poverty, you wouldn't necessarily be praising me to the, you know, moving you from a shack with no electricity and no water and anything to a better shack that is just slightly better protected for rain and sanitation is not much of an improvement. And you still got no running water, still haven't got an indoor toilet, and you still haven't got electricity. It's not really a great progress, but it's still better than not having even a proper shelter around you, right? So it's all relative. Refocus spending. So they did invest a huge amount of money on roads and infrastructure, education. If you look at Britain, Boris Johnson is promising to spend huge amounts of money on roads and infrastructure, because most governments understand that when you spend money on the infrastructure of the country, it creates lots of jobs and it creates better investment environment, because people from outside think the country's improving, infrastructure's improving, people feel more positive, it makes people want to open more businesses, makes people want to invest, and it generally builds up the economy and it creates jobs for people. Because if you're building a road, you need thousands of people to build a road. You need loads of subcontractors, you need resources. So it creates money in the economy. If you have thousands of people building a road, the thousands of people who live in that area are going to buy shops, buying Sainsbury's, they're going to buy shoes, they're going to buy food, they're going to buy other goods and services locally. So generally an industrial town grows very fast because the thousands and thousands of people who move into that area to work are spending money in the economy, and it creates loads of softer things. You need barbers, you need decorators, you need all the trades to do your homes, you need people who can let their property, you need people who can buy a property. So you see it creates loads of other jobs when you have industrialization. When you live in a rural area and you have subsistence, it doesn't create much wealth, because if the only money I have is to just survive, I'm not going to feed your shop, I'm not going to feed your estate agents, I'm not going to feed your barbers, I'm not going to feed your hairdressers and your restaurants, and so that none of these things develop. So the rural areas stay poor. Once you develop infrastructure and you start to bring a bit of money in and people start to earn a little bit of salary, they start spending that salary locally in the bakers, in the restaurants, in the supermarkets, and in those different services local. And all those people who are also in those places with those small businesses then spend their money back in the local community. And that's how money gets recirculated. That's why most countries look at industrial parks and cities, because wealth is created much stronger in a city and an industrial area than it is in a rural area. Because if subsistence farming doesn't develop, and therefore that's why rural areas always develop slower than industrial areas. And in fact, the industrial areas and the wealth from industrial areas is what is used to develop the rural areas. Okay, so it's really important you understand these things. This is why understanding economics in leadership is so important, because no good being a political leader who doesn't understand economics. Because if you don't understand economics and you can't get the right people in, you don't know what on earth you're doing. And even with the best moral policies, you could be all over the place. Because if you don't understand these basic things, you'll have all sorts of confusion in your policies. Oh, we must develop the rural areas. But if you develop the rural areas, you need to develop the rural areas. Of course you do. But you need to think about, if you develop a city, you can build so much more wealth to develop that area and also improve the economy of the rural areas. If you just develop the rural areas, it won't drive the other areas. So this is the dilemma we have with these moral issues. So they did spend more on rural areas and more on healthcare and education as well. They did improve the size of the road network, because again, as I said, if you can't get your goods to market and you don't have electricity, who's gonna open a factory in your country if there's no electricity, or the electricity keeps cutting out all the time? Nobody's gonna wanna open a factory in your country if you can't guarantee power and resources. You can't guarantee water, you can't guarantee sewage systems, you can't guarantee electricity. You're not gonna invest there. And also, when you go from your factory to the marketplace, you've got to drive down some broke down roads, which is going to take you longer to get your goods to market. Your lorries crash, they break down. It's just not an efficient way of doing business. So that's why it's so important to develop the infrastructure of the country, because all of it drives wealth. The longer it takes your goods to get to market, the more expensive it is to get them to market. Therefore, it makes your products and services less economic. So this is all very important. So this is the part of leadership I would support and agree that this is what they should do. Boost school enrollment. Again, if you want your country to develop, you need an educated young people. If half the country is young and they're not going to school and illiterate, then you've got a big problem. Because as your country develops, you have the same problem again. Where's the labor going to come from? Now, if you're rural, you can have loads of just manual labor. But again, people earning pittance, it doesn't develop the economy if most people are earning pittance. If people can get salaried jobs, that salary job in turn, you'll spend that money in the economy and create more jobs. So that's the concept behind this. So if young people get educated, the more educated people are, this is universal anywhere in the world. The more educated people are, the more ambitious they are. The more ambitious they are and more educated they are, the better job they want or business they want to open. The more educated they are, the more open they are to do different jobs. See, if you've got no education and you've never been to school or you've hardly done any school, your written and skills are very low. So how do you then start a laptop business or start some sort of industrial business or some other business when you can hardly read or write? Not many people who are illiterate or semi-illiterate have become successful in business. It's not saying you can't, but it's much more difficult to do it. You know, how are you going to develop a business when you haven't got a degree or you haven't got any knowledge of you know, like industrial products? If you look at Dyson, for example, people like this, people who create things, you know, Elon Musk, these people, they create wealth because they industrialize and they're using technology and so on to develop. So this is how these things happen, all right? So let's keep going. Health and water coverage, of course, you need more people. These are all the basic, you'll see in all these countries, the same things need to be addressed. How do you get more people to school? How do you have more school facilities? Because if you haven't got the facilities, you can't get them to school. And then when they go to school, have they got drinking water? Have they got books? Have they, you know, it's just a constant thing of needing wealth. This is why I am such a big one on wealth creation and economics, because without that, you can have all the morals in the world and say that all children should go to school and everybody should have free healthcare. Everybody should have all these things, but where's the money coming from to do it? You need to create wealth to be able to pay for these things. You can do so much voluntarily, but you can't do everything through voluntarily. You have to pay teachers, you have to pay for best things. Some of these things you're going to have to buy them, because if your country doesn't produce everything, all the textbooks, you know, all the furniture for the school, if your country's not producing all these things because there's very little economy, you've got to import them. If you've got to import them, they're much more expensive. You know, if you import all your desks and your computers and your school equipment and everything from the West, it's going to cost you a lot more than if it's produced locally. But if there's no industry locally, well, where are you getting it from? So this is the vicious cycle of not having a strong economy, is you constantly in this problem where the government has to keep on spending all its money on on other people outside the country to get everything you need because your country hasn't got good economics. So another interesting thing that I surprised when I read this, Ethiopia has one of the best social safety nets in Africa, helping over 8 million people. Now, that's not, it sounds good, but when I looked at it another way, I thought, that's not that great. Because if you've got one of the best systems and it only covers 8 million people and you've got a population of 110 million, that means 100 million aren't covered. And if you've got a country, which I'll show you shortly, has very, very low income, that means there's a lot of people who need help aren't getting it. So, as I said, a mixed picture in Ethiopia, some positives and some green shoots, but it's not good enough yet. And let's look at some other thing. This is from World Bank information. Challenges, this is some of the challenges Ethiopia face right now. Your challenges, reoccurring expenditure versus capital. Now, again, because I've studied economics, I understand this, so I'll explain it to you. Now, governments can get capital. Capital just means injections of cash or one-off cash. So capital is like, if I need to buy a car, I need capital. You see, I need £5,000, say, to buy a car, £20,000 to buy a car. Now, I might borrow the money or I might do a deal, but I need the capital to buy the car. Now, the problem is once I get the car, that's fine. And this is where you have this joke about, you know, black man wagon, BMW, all this. We have these jokes, right? You buy the BMW or the Mercedes and you have the money to buy it, which is the capital, but you don't have the money to run it. So when the tires go, you can't fix it. You can't put petrol in it. You can't, you know, if it breaks down, you can't put a new gearbox in it, etc. Because you had the capital to buy the car, but you didn't have the money to run it. This is the same problem that governments have. So Saudi Arabia gives you £10 million to build a road. That's great. America gives you £20 million to build a road. That's great. But once the road's built, who's looking after it afterwards? So if the government doesn't create wealth itself, it hasn't got reoccurring revenue. And this is what we mean by reoccurring expenditure, to fix things. So you build a school, but how do you pay for the electricity? How do you pay for the books? Who pays for the teachers? So again, this is the difference. This is why aid is doesn't work. Because you give aid, you create dependence. So you give me the school, that's great. Thank you very much for giving me the school. Now, how do I get teachers in it? See, if I don't have any sustainable, so it wouldn't be better if you bought me a building that could produce wealth. This is why we have, again, mixed understanding of economics in Africa. See, if I was a leader in Africa, I want industrialization all the way. Because if I can industrialize, you have ever heard the saying, give somebody a fish, you'll have to give them a fish every day. Teach them to fish and they can feed forever. So if you give me a building, a factory, if I ask China, build me a factory, I want you to build me a factory that can make money for the country. I can build as many schools as I want and I can pay for loads of teachers. But if you build me a school, it's great. Thank you for building me the school. But if I don't have the money for the teachers and the books and to make the school run, the building's just sitting there empty with nothing going on because I can't pay the teachers and I can't pay anybody. So capital is great, but you must have recurring income. Ethiopia has a problem with that because they don't have enough cash coming in. So things like customer service is a problem as well, which is not unsurprising in Africa. Many parts of the world, we have this problem. So it's another thing we need to improve all over Africa. Customer service is very important because, again, you might think it doesn't matter, but it creates problems in your economy. Nobody likes going to a country and getting crap service or poor service, right? Poor service doesn't encourage growth, doesn't create great stories and encouragement for you to go back. So foreign visitors notice these things and it can have an impact. What foreign country have you been to where you get excellent service, therefore you want to go back? Okay, if you get really bad service, you badmouth the country, come back and says, oh, it was a very nice country to look at, but the service was terrible. That's not encouraging people to visit. Road maintenance, I've mentioned already, because they've built lots of infrastructure, but then the money to fix it is a bit of a strain. Even in Britain, my road has no tar on it. I don't know how many of you know Britain very well, but I know where I live, and I live in a suburb, and the place hasn't got money because the council is starved of resources, because I understand how things work. So the council hasn't got enough money to maintain the roads, so the roads are not maintained. The main roads are well maintained in Britain because the government funds it, but the side roads are maintained by the council, and the council is not given the money by the government and doesn't have enough income to maintain the side roads. So side roads in England are quite poor in many places, but the main roads are fine. Improved tax collection is a big issue as well. I'll show you later. Very small percentage of business owners in Ethiopia, less than 30% of business owners in Ethiopia even have a bank account. It's hard to imagine this. Let me say that again. Less than 30% of people who have a business in Ethiopia have a bank account, which means it's very difficult to track and trace what people's incomes are. And it's very difficult to tax people who have no declared income. You know, the income's not going through any structure. So cash means it's very difficult to tax me. So it's a big problem in Africa as well. In any poor country, if you can't collect enough taxes, you're also struggling to pay for things in your country. It doesn't matter what your tax rate is if you don't collect it. I can have a 50% tax rate, but if I'm not collecting it from people, it's a 0% tax rate. So it's not the percentage of tax, it's a part of it, but you also need to be efficient at collecting money, otherwise you have a problem. These are all key leadership issues when we talk about Africa. You can have all the right morals, you can say all the right things, but if you don't understand these things, you're going to go bankrupt your country and you're going to have an economic crisis. So this is things you need to know. So boosting domestic revenues, this is the same point I'm making. If you don't boost domestic revenue, you don't have enough cash inside the economy. So China right now has moved from just being manufacturing for the world to getting Chinese people to spend more money within the Chinese economy. So more Chinese people buying Chinese cars, Chinese phones, Chinese property, Chinese goods and services means that China is growing itself. You see, one of the mistakes in Africa as well without industrializing is nearly everything you buy in Africa has to be imported. Now, I already mentioned it. If everything's imported, it's more expensive. And if everything's imported means you're depending on everybody other than your own to develop your own economy. So that puts massive pressure on your costs. And if your currency, many of us know this who travel back to your family's homes in Africa or the Caribbean or wherever you're from, when that currency drops, everything's more expensive for them. So when you go on holiday, your pound is worth more when you go back. So you're laughing because everything's cheaper. But when they buy exports, it's much more expensive, because if you could get 10, whatever your currency is, to a pound, and then it's 70 to a pound, suddenly anything you buy from England is 7 times more expensive than it was before. So that's the problem with not having enough revenue internally and foreign exchange. Now, one of the other problems is investing in healthcare, education, but not doing it regionally and not distributing it well. So here's another dilemma. Not only you need enough money, you also need to make sure the money is distributed across the country, because if you don't, you're going to get regions that hate you. See, if I was the Prime Minister of England and I said, right, I lived in Chingford, so I'm just going to help people in Chingford and East London, the people in other parts of the country are going to say, hang on, why aren't we getting any share of the pie? So then you create disputes and you create political problems, because those people will want to overthrow me, because they're going to say, look, when you come to power, you're only looking after your people. And then when they come into power, they only look after their people. So it's very important. But again, if you don't create the wealth, it's very difficult to look after your people. So again, it's like having too many children. If me as a father just went and had children all over the place and I never had the money to look after them, it's all well and good having the children. But if I can't look after them, all my children are struggling because I haven't got the money to look after them. And that's the dilemma you have. Or I only look after some children and I don't look after others. You're going to create resentment, which is the same thing you have in society. Not enough efficiency in public spending, which means it's wasted. So if you don't allocate efficiently, you're wasting public money. Other risks in the country right now is weather patterns. Because of where Ethiopia is, it has a tendency to have droughts. So it is an ongoing problem in Ethiopia. But now, Ethiopia has done a lot more to prevent droughts or major problems, because you can bring in water supplies to crops without rain. You see, if you just rely on rain, you have a problem. See, when Gaddafi was in power in Libya, he built the great man-made river. And the great man-made river was to irrigate Libya. If you look at Dubai, Dubai has been irrigated, isn't it? Dubai was a desert 50, 60 years ago, right? Now it's a phenomenal metropolis, but it's got all the water it needs, but it doesn't rain. So how does it have all the water it needs, but it doesn't rain? It's because they pump the water in, and they've put the water in through pipes. So there's all the water you need. Now you can irrigate the desert if you have water, But if you don't have infrastructure and you don't have wealth, you have the same problem again. So drought kills your country because you haven't got the money to put the infrastructure in to put the water. So if it doesn't rain, basically, there's no water. If it doesn't rain for 10 years, then what? You're just starving. So this is why it's so important that we have these things in infrastructure. This is what I say about leadership. Hopefully I'm making you understand and you're learning. Leadership isn't just about your moral compass. Leadership needs to have competence. You need to understand these things, otherwise you're going to make a right mess of your country. And this is what happens with a lot of leaders. A lot of leaders get into power, not just in Africa, but in Africa as well, who haven't got much education on economics and understanding these things. They don't spend time learning it. And when they get into power, they're all over the place because they don't understand these basic principles. But the economy is better prepared to deal with, as I said, the wet patterns. Uprisings against the economic reforms has created problems as well. State of emergency. Now, if you don't know what a state of emergency is, if you haven't lived in certain countries, you probably never experienced it. But a state of emergency is when the government suspends the constitution. Now, you need to understand what this means. If you suspend the constitution, what it normally means is that the ruler, the president or the prime minister, has unparalleled power because the constitution is suspended, and it means one person or the government as a whole decides everything. Now, Britain is in a state of emergency at the moment, in a sense, not literally, but in a subtle way. Now, telling me I can't leave my house is an extra power that the government hasn't got before. So the government didn't have the power to say to me, you've got to wear a mask, you've got to wear gloves, you've got to wash your hands. These things were what you do in a state of emergency, where you immediately have a crisis like a pandemic, and you say, the prime minister goes on TV and says, you can't leave your house. All restaurants have to close. You can't play football anymore. You can't play sport. You can't have stadiums. Most of these things were not written in any law. So that's a state of emergency. Now, Britain isn't one of those countries that had uprisings. Now, what if the people had rioted? Some countries in the world, they've been rioting and on the street saying, we're not accepting it. But Britain just accepted it because the government in Britain is seen as legitimate. So most people accepted it. When they said close restaurants, restaurants shut. When they said stop playing football, they stopped playing football. So the point is, most people went along with it. But a state of emergency can be a crisis because in bad countries where the government isn't good, like Ethiopia, state of emergency start meaning it's an excuse to arrest people, to harass the media, start arresting people because they don't agree with you, starting to repress people, and just like what they did in Turkey, for example, when they claimed that there was a state of emergency, when the Turkish president started arresting people all over the place. We've got a chat here. Let me just have a look at what it says. Just want to check. Somebody said turn off the internet like recently. I'm not sure what that means. Can you just give me a chat? People, just put in the chat. Are you hearing me okay? Is the signal and the imagery okay right now? Can you just put something in the chat just to tell me that you can hear me all right? Okay. All right. Thank you. Thank you very much. It just said there was a message in there saying something about the internet, so I wasn't really sure. So it might have been their internet went off. Okay, no problem. I just wanted to make sure everybody can hear. Thank you. Thanks very much. Brilliant. So let's keep going. One more chat. Let's have a quick look at that chat. Oh, great. Thank you. Brilliant. Yeah. Yes. Oh, see what that's right. Now I understand what you meant. What they were saying is, my comment was, that comment about turning off the internet was in the context of Ethiopia. Oh, right. I understand the point now. So basically, yes, one of the techniques of silencing people is to turn off the internet. Of course. Yes. Because in Britain, when the whole COVID thing happened, what did people do? Everybody went on WhatsApp. Everybody started going on YouTube and watching conspiracies and videos and God knows sharing. Now, if the government turned the internet off, there would have been mayhem, because you couldn't watch your Sky TV, you couldn't get the internet, lots of people couldn't work. It would have been riots on the street. So can you imagine in Ethiopia, when they turn off the internet, what would happen? Now, remember, most people in countries like Ethiopia won't have the internet anyway, because most people don't have electricity. But those who do will be very angry and they'll protest and there'll be problems. All right. Right. Let's keep going. And the other thing is your restrictions on movement and access to information. That's, again, starving people of information is a way of keeping power over them. And freedom of movement is a way of stopping people having power if you stop them moving and associating. Yep. Yes, thank you. Yes. Yeah, Ethiopia turn off the power. Yes, thanks for that comment. And classic strategy across North Africa and the Middle East. Yes, you just deny people access to the internet. Now, again, we can be moral about these issues, but we have to be careful. China restricts the internet, and most people see it as negative with a certain mindset. On another level, you can say, well, there's certain things on the internet that are not positive. And should there be more restrictions? Should the internet just be open with things like pornography, people killing on the internet and doing all kinds of things they post on the internet, encouraging people to kill, terrorism and whatever? So governments still try to reduce some of the most extreme things that people use the internet for that's not positive. You know, encouraging people to kill somebody and doing things like that, teaching people how to make bombs, or there's certain things that shouldn't be on the internet. So governments who don't control the internet, if you look at what's happened quite recently, there's been a lot of criticism of Facebook, Twitter, Google for not allowing certain things to allowing too much freedom, racism. You know, should we blame Facebook for people to put racist things up? And if you Google beautiful people on Google, do black people come up? See, this is all part of racism. So you can say these institutions are not totally objective. So if they're not totally objective, should they not have some control over them? Should they just be able to say anything they want? See, TV in this country is regulated, but the newspapers are very unregulated. So the newspapers can more or less say anything, even if it's not true, and it's difficult to challenge it. So should there be no regulation? Could I just lie and say anything I want? So once we look at these things, we have to look again. Good leadership is saying, well, should we just allow people to say anything they want? What happens if it creates violence? What if I say something about another ethnic group and that leads to a war, like they did in Rwanda? Is that a good thing? So some things should be restricted. So we have to be careful. But the way they did it in Ethiopia was predominantly negative. I do agree with that. Let's keep going. Right, let's look at East African integration. Ethiopia is a landlocked country, as I mentioned before. So this is just some of the stuff here. They have the Ethiopian community, okay? And it was re-established in 2000. So again, there's a little bit of history of problems since the collapse of some of these institutions, right? Since 1977. So, you know, it's in the last 20 years, there's been more integration between East African countries. And now Rwanda, Burundi, and South Sudan, the newest country in Africa, has become part of that. So, and the East African community is considered the most progressive, most integrated, and the fastest economic region in Africa. If you look at the economic growth levels in Kenya, Tanzania, Rwanda, Uganda, that whole region is really growing very, very quickly, Tanzania as well. And they also have some big populations, including Ethiopia. So when you put all those powerhouses together, that's actually a very, very powerful region with hundreds, with probably about 200 million people. I'm not sure the total number, but a very large number of people. When you look at the population of Tanzania, Kenya, and Ethiopia on its own, it's huge. So the population of East Africa is very, very big and potentially could be huge economic activity. And it is a very, very strong economic region. Recent railway built between Djibouti and Ethiopia. There's talks of railways between Rwanda and Tanzania, and a railway between Tanzania and Kenya, railways between the same parts and Uganda. This will make regional integration stronger. You see, if you look at the integration in the European Union, is very strong. I can jump on a train. My sister lives in Belgium, just as an example. At Christmas, sometimes I go over to my sister in Belgium. We jump on a car in here in London. I drive down to the coast, jump on the shuttle, and within half an hour, I'm going from England to France. That's integration, isn't it? Because it's easy for me to get from England to France very quickly in half an hour on a train. That's because they've integrated. Then when I get to France, I go through very quickly through the system, so I don't have to do much immigration checks. And I drive through France, into Belgium with nobody stops me, no checklist or anything. And then on the way back, it's only when I get into France, just before I go on the shuttle, that I have to show my passport again. So the point is that integration means that it's easy to do business. It's easy for people to travel and move around. If you make it difficult for people to move around East Africa or any part of Africa, it's not encouraging tourism. It's not encouraging people to move for jobs. It's not encouraging migration, and it's not encouraging investment. Because why am I going to invest somewhere where it's difficult for me to do business on the border? You know, I don't want to move to Rwanda and then find I can't do trade on the border because there's a war and all kinds of problems. That's not going to encourage me to move there. So these are all very important things about integration. There's been a lot of speeches by Paul Kagame about the relationship and the broken relationship or damaged relationship between Rwanda and Uganda, and sometimes Rwanda and Sudan, and Congo. And that economic or political problem creates problems for business. Because again, why would I want to be on the border if there's a bit of dispute and I'm worried about war? I won't want to be too close to that border, would I? So it damages investment a lot. And relationships generally in the region on East Africa are generally pretty good. There are tensions, but they're generally pretty good. And there is a lot of regional integration in East Africa. It's one of the best examples. One of the most integrated areas in the world after Europe. That's quite a strong thing to say, isn't it? East African Business Council has boosted its profile during this current crisis. And I just got some examples, some random examples that I just looked on the internet, and I wanted to see the East African Business Council and some of the voluntary organizations have done a lot of work between youth, business, and women across East Africa. And I think that's a great example to all of us in Africa, that women across borders, so you've got women from different places doing relationship. If you go to the border of Rwanda and the Congo, which I have, and unfortunately I haven't got any footage of it because I took a picture and the policeman said I mustn't take any pictures, so I had to delete them. But we weren't allowed to take any pictures, otherwise I would have shown you a video on the border of between Congo and Rwanda, near Lake Kivu. There's a massive, massive human trail looking like ants of women moving between the Congo and Rwanda doing business. Just loads of women, 99% of them are women doing trade, moving trade between Congo and Rwanda. So you see my point. Now, all those women who are making money from selling goods and services across the border between the Congo and Rwanda, if there's a dispute, that's income is wiped out. So it's very important that we can do this, because that means you're missing out in a whole area you can't do trade and you can't travel to if you can't move across these borders. And also, many people have the same ethnic groups, same languages on these borders, because these borders were created by the West and they're artificial borders. So we need to break them down. This is just an example. This is some of the pictures. I took a few pictures just so I wanted to show you. This is 50 young East Africans came together, you know, at the headquarters of the EAC, which is the integration, one of the headquarters of the integration, to discuss young people's participation in the political process during the first high-level youth ambassadors dialogue back in 2018. You see, this is brilliant because you have different young people who, when they grow up, when they become leaders, what is their relationship between their brothers and sisters in other places? See, if you grow up, it's like Europeans, right? In the European Union, the average young person in Europe, not England, because we've got Brexit and you've got anti-Europe people in Britain, but in Europe, mainland Europe, young people are predominantly positive about European integration. The average young person in Europe has learned 3-4 languages. So if you go to France, Germany, most of them speak French, English, Spanish. They speak 3 or 4 European languages. So what that means is they see themselves as Europeans. So they move from France to Germany, to England, to Spain for work, for business, for friendship, for whatever. And it means that you have that constant flow, which moves money and creates wealth and a positive relationship. So when they get into power, they've already got a positive relationship with each other. In Africa, historically, when we're not moving between borders and we've got no relationship with our borders, when you become the president or the prime minister or whatever, you've got no history of relationships. So it's all cold and have to be developed. There's nothing like meeting an old school friend, is there? If you meet an old school friend or old university friend or old college friend or somebody you used to work with years ago, don't you just shake hands and hug? And it's that immediately you have a connection. So if you encourage young people and women to have relationship across borders, that will last you for many, many years, because it's very difficult to have a negative attitude towards your neighbor. If some of your best friends, people you went to university with and college with and you did youth activities with, you're not going to have a negative view of your neighbor. So people who have racist views about another country, it's very unlikely to happen if you went and lived there for a while. So if you see anybody who hates any country or people, generally are very ignorant around those people. They don't actually know much about them. See, if you went, people wouldn't be so racist towards countries if you knew more about them and spent more time integrating together. So it's really important that we do this in Africa as well. So I'm very, very positive about this. Look at this one. This is a sort of a voluntary organization. It's sort of like I can't think it's like a voluntary organization. Yeah, sort of a charitable thing. They incubate small scale regional integration projects. So anything kind of, they're encouraging cross-border business and activities. These are all the projects in different areas. So you see the Kenyan flag, you see Tanzania flag, you see Rwandan flag, Uganda, etc. These are integration in the region. So projects. So that's a great idea, to encourage you to invest and do business and have cultural exchanges between the local areas. You see, you think about all the business that's done in Europe. You've got the Champions League, you've got sporting integration, you've got musical and cultural integration. You have so much integration in science, in business, and so on between European Union countries, which means that they're all benefiting from technology, they benefit from science development, you know, all the research they're doing, even like what they're doing now with the trying to get the vaccine for COVID-19, there's relationships between Europe working with each other as partnerships. You're using security and military partnership. This all stops disputes. It's much less likely to have disputes unless you're Britain, who is so antagonistic to the European Union, you come up with Brexit. So that's an exception, a sort of small island mentality. Now, let's get right up to the modern era. So we're going to go into the last 2 years as we finish off this last half hour. So let me just show you, this is the new Prime Minister, Abiy Ahmed. He's only 42 years old, so he's a relatively young leader in Africa, because many leaders in Africa like Mugabe and whatever were well in their 90s by the time they came out of power. So hopefully he won't still be in power in 50 years' time. So literally April 2018, he came to power when suddenly the other Prime Minister resigned. Now, he's been a very reforming Prime Minister, very modern Prime Minister in many respects, very progressive. So what has he done? So unexpectedly becomes Prime Minister when Haile Mariam resigned. Now, he's the first Oromo leader, the ethnic group that was at the center of nearly 3 years of anti-government protests. So they're a particular ethnic group that always felt left out by the previous governments. So obviously when he became leader, that was seen as quite a positive thing. That was really, really important. And, you know, there was so much clashes and arrests over this whole issue. So that's a big plus. So he's the leader of the Oromo People's Democratic Organization, one of the 4 ethnic parties which make up the ruling, same party I mentioned before, the ruling EP, RDF, is made up of different ethnic groups in a coalition. So at least they've got a coalition. It'll be good one day for them to get rid of all the ethnic groups. And when I say get rid of the ethnic groups, I don't mean physically them personally. I mean the political parties that represent, because it's negative when you represent an ethnic group. There's always going to be conflict if you have an ethnocentric political strategy. So I'm against ethnocentric political strategies. Yes, have an African party. Yes, have a nationalist party from African, but not a party that's only for Muslims, only for Christians, only for Orthodox Ethiopians, only for this tribe or that tribe. That's divisive, and I'm opposed to it. We're never going to get African integration if we set up parties like that. So I'm very pleased. And it's interesting that one of his parents are Christian and one of his parents are Muslim. So again, he's quite symbolic of that unity in Ethiopia. So who is he? Yep, his father was a Muslim, or is a Muslim, and his mother is a Christian, which is very common in Africa to have no conflict between religious groups. It's quite surprising how uncommon that there is conflict. You see so many places in the world there's war and fights over religion. There's very little history of that in Africa. You go to Gambia on holiday and you see Christian and Muslim sitting next to each other having a conversation and living in peace and harmony between each other. They're not killing each other. That's generally the case. So 14 years, at 14, he joined the armed struggle against the Marxist regime. So you see that. So he got involved at such a young age. He was involved in politics at a very young age. He's educated, and look at what he's educated in. He has a doctorate degree in peace and security, and he has a master's in transformational leadership. Isn't that interesting? So I wasn't surprised after I learned what he did, that he had these degrees. because somebody who's got a doctorate in peace and security, and no surprising, he's done peace and security. He's won the Nobel Peace Prize. He won the Nobel Peace Prize in the first year in office. So it shows that he practices what he preaches. He's educated in this, and he's a transformational leadership, means that he's educated in how to transform and lead people. It's fantastic. So again, people talk about formal education. It's not everything, but do you want leaders who are not educated? Do you want leaders who have not been educated in certain things, even if they're self-educated? Because if they're not, we're going to have a hell of a problem in Africa. Would you want people to lead you and be the prime minister and the president who hasn't even got much education in anything? So what are they leading us down? You know, they're all over the place. So it's very important that we have this. He also speaks fluent languages of the different ethnic groups, which means he can communicate with the different ethnic groups, which also helps him to be able to communicate internationally and locally in his own country. So he's more likely to be trusted if you speak the language of the people. It's always going to be easier. He served as a UN peacekeeper in Rwanda, so he knows what happened in Rwanda. He knows about the post-genocide in Rwanda because he was a peacekeeper in Rwanda. And he also meant he served in Rwanda, which means he has, I'm assuming, a positive relationship and thinking about Rwanda. Yeah, he founded the Ethiopian Information Network Security Agency. Now, this is a little bit controversial because he was on the board of the Telecom and Ethiopian TV when they created the point you made earlier, when they turned off the internet and did certain things. He was part of that. So that's a little bit of a controversial history he's got there, because we're talking about security agency. We're not talking about a telecoms agency here. So he entered politics formally in 2010, although he was in politics before that, as you said, but formally entered politics in 2010. And he was just an ordinary member of the organization. And he joined the party's executive committee in 2015. So his rise to power is very, very quick. And in 2016, he briefly served as a Minister of Science and Technology. So he did have some experience in government before he became Prime Minister. And then he was Prime Minister 2 years later. So let's look at some of his reforms. In May, remember, he was Prime Minister in April. And in May, he freed thousands of political prisoners, including the opposition leader. Now, this is a major, major, major move. If you become the leader of a country and you release the political prisoners, immediately you've got a bit of credibility because you've practicing what you're preaching, because you're not leaving everybody in prison. Yes. So you've mentioned, yes. So somebody's mentioned here that they turned off the internet as recently as 2 weeks ago. So they're still doing some of these behaviors. So again, it's repressive behavior, so it's not positive. But he did some good things in these first few months. He lifted the state of emergency 2 months earlier than he needed to. He accepted the border ruling about the dispute with the Eritrea. After all these years of war, overnight, within 2 months of this guy coming into power, he just says no more and ends the dispute overnight. You see, this is a lack of ego. This is a great example of African leadership, because you put your ego to one side and say to Eritrea, look, I'm going to be the bigger person. You can have it. Have it. If I've got a massive cake and you've only got a little cake, why am I going to keep arguing about the little cake? Why don't I let you have the little cake? Because don't you deserve to have some cake? So keep arguing about it. You're just fighting and fighting and fighting when you don't even need the whole cake. So why are you arguing? This is ego. So this is why I say this is a good example of leadership. By July, he met the Eritrean president and declares an end to the war between the two countries within 2 or 3 months. This is a country that's been, the two countries been at war for decades. And within 2 months, just shake hands. Let's be brothers. Let's stop the war. But you have to have the bigger party. You see, it's always the bigger party that needs to be the one who compromises. In any major war, the country with more power has to be the one to put their hand out to the smaller power. Small organizations and minorities can never end war. So in Palestine and Israel right now, Palestine cannot end the conflict in Israel, between Israel and Palestine. Only Israel can end it, because Israel is the more powerful government. Israel is the wealthier government. Israel is the one that gets all the support from the West. So the only way you're going to have peace in Palestine is when Israel accepts the rights of the Palestinian people. So let's move on. By September, it opens the land border between Ethiopia and Eritrea. Now, can you imagine how mad it was to have along the whole coast, between you and the whole coast, the only thing separating Ethiopia from the major coastline is Eritrea, and you've had a land dispute where you can't cross that border. It's madness, absolute madness. So now the border's open. It will open up economic opportunities. Eritrea, as one of the secretive states, is compared to somewhere like the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. Often people call it North Korea, and Eritrea now is going to also benefit from those economic reforms, because that cross-border economy is going to open up a whole 110 million people to Eritrea. Now, if those 110 million people buy any Eritrean goods, it's going to create wealth for the Eritrean people. So this is an example of where it doesn't make sense to have these wars in Africa and these disputes. By just in a few months, he appoints 50% of his country, of his ministerial posts for women. The only two countries in Africa that have 50% women in ministerial positions is Rwanda and Ethiopia. Why? There's no reason for it other than just poor leadership. Overnight, we should do it. Just commit. We're going to have 50% of our ministers women. Why not? 50% of our population is women. 50% of ministers should be women. Don't talk about it. Do it. There's no reason why you can't do it. And the parliament elected the first woman head of state. So a woman, Ethiopian, was the first woman president, the first female head of state in Ethiopia since the empress back in the 1920s. Can you believe that? So again, this is only in a few months, and I'm sure he influenced that situation. So now you have a woman. How powerful is it to other women in Ethiopia to see a woman, the president of the country, the head of the country? That really sent something, a message to women in Ethiopia. So it's not just significant as in just an act, it's very symbolic as well. Here's the peace. Look at this. Holding up the peace between these two countries. On the left, Ethiopian Prime Minister. On the right, Eritrean Prime Minister or President. This is them here. You know, had a meeting between each other just to secure peace. You know, it's just unbelievable what happened here. Unblocked hundreds of websites and TV channels. Opened up, and it's no surprise he won the Nobel Peace Prize for what he did. Ended the war that was going on for decades, overnight. Fantastic. I think it's a great example. Right, let's have a look at the impact of some of these reforms. This is generally in Ethiopia. This is not just in the last 2 years. This is generally in Ethiopia and lots of different things. So ethnic tensions in such a country boiled over into violence has forced some 2.5 million people from their homes. So there's still problems in Ethiopia. So even though there's no problem, well, I shouldn't say no problem, there's less of a problem with Eritrea now, there's still been a lot of internal ethnic tensions. You see, this is why I don't agree with ethnic politics, because these ethnic tensions are fueled by leaders who divide people for power. We should be telling the people of Ethiopia, you're one people. The leaders there should stop telling them that they're this ethnic group and that ethnic group and say, we're one people, let's come together as one people. If you keep dividing people as ethnic groups, they'll keep fighting all the time. So in 2019, 2 of his closest allies were killed. This is when there was an attempt on his life. So this is what I'm saying. It's quite serious, the situation in terms of countries. This is it's still a volatile place, Ethiopia. More than 60 of his officials, including the former head of the military, run business conglomerate and former deputy head of the National Intelligence Agency, were arrested amid an investigation into corruption and human rights. We said this before. As part of the leadership, we said, are they corrupt? We want to see some of these people get arrested and get done for corruption. Because if people aren't getting arrested for corruption, I guarantee there's nobody's doing anything about corruption. Because there's always going to be corruption. It's just how much you deal with it. And are you willing to arrest your own people to do it? So including the former head of the military to deal with them. Government's growth strategy and structural reforms has been really positive. They've really strengthen the private sector, they boost competition in the area. Now, I understand classic right-wing politics talks about competition and free markets. Now, I'm not an advocate of outright free markets and just allowing everything to just be free and open. What I do believe, though, is that some competition does drive efficiency and some competition just keep prices down. So if you don't have competition, you have complacency, and sometimes the people pay a heavy price. Like, look at Britain, where you have gas and electric bills have gone through the roof because there's not enough competition, really. It's monopolized by 4 big powers. And because the government has allowed that to happen, we're paying a huge price for our gas and electricity in this country. So you have to get the balance right. It's not just having the private sector, it's how you allow the private sector to function. Otherwise, you just exploit the people. So it's important that you do that correctly. So they are moving away from their historical state-led economic development to a more private sector development. Yeah, so there's few restrictions on foreign direct investment. There's still some restrictions on banking and telecoms, but even that they're opening up now because they're selling off, I think, 49% of the telecom company to bring in more investment so they can have more people with the access to the internet and telephones and so on. And they do have a homegrown economic reform program, which I also like. So they're promoting and encouraging economic development among their own people. Let me just have a quick water break and I'm going to go to the next one. So I was wrong with my figure. The figure I quoted earlier was even lower than what I thought. Only 16% of the private sector use banks. You see the problem here? I mentioned this earlier. If you have 84% of the private sector not using a bank, it means the government is not getting any taxes or very little taxes from these people. If 84% of people are not paying taxes or very little taxes from the private sector, you're starving the government of income. So one of the reforms they need to do is to formalize the economy, get more people using banks, and get more tax from people. Now, you can be cynical about this, but a good administration should do this effectively. Rwanda apparently is one of the best places in the world for collecting taxes. And it's very important because if you don't collect your taxes, you can't pay your bills. So it's very, very important. Oh, we've got another chat. Let me have a quick look at what that is. How does Ethiopia's growth strategy compare to its historical growth strategies of Singapore and North Korea? Well, the strategy that they used during Mengistu's time is much closer to the North Korean model, which is the model of state-owned, Soviet-backed, much more state control of the whole economy. The modern approach to economic reform is much closer to the Singapore model and the South Korean model. Sorry, you meant South Korea. Okay, yeah. So it's much closer to the Singapore and South Korean model, which is much more a mixture of government aiding the private sector growth and enabling the economy to grow, but it's also allowing people to have wealth. Now, where I do have a bit of a problem is the amount of rich people and the amount of wealth, as in the extreme wealth. So you got so many billionaires in China now and billionaires all over Asia. Now, I'm not saying I'm against billionaires as a principle, but we have to balance the wealth in the hands of a few private people against the wealth of the masses. And if you allow too much wealth in the hands of the private individuals, then you're going to get, again, starving the people of resources, because wealthy people buy politicians. Wealthy people sponsor political parties and make sure that there's political parties who make sure that they don't pay high taxes. If you look at Donald Trump in America, look at the amount of money that the private sector would have offered him. Because he was a real wealthy individual, he didn't need it. But right-wing governments get massive support from business, big business, because they want a politician who's sympathetic to them and won't have high taxes. So we do need to get the balance right on these issues. Let's have a look at this homegrown policy. Homegrown economic reform for the purpose of growth and job creation and poverty reduction. So very important. Grow the economy of Ethiopians so it helps create jobs and helps reduce poverty, because the best way to reduce poverty is to get people working and get people self-employed. Those are the two best ways to reduce poverty. You can't reduce, nobody in the world reduces poverty by just giving people money. That doesn't really work. If you look at Britain with the big welfare state, has it worked? Just giving people benefits doesn't really get you out of poverty. It makes you dependent. Now, yes, temporarily, you should give people benefits when they're sick, if you can't work, when you've got young children, when you're a pensioner. Yes, no problem with that. But people who are just able-bodied, sitting down doing nothing, that's a waste of resource. You don't want to pay people for doing nothing. Give them an incentive to not work. So job creation is the best way to get people out of poverty, because people who get jobs and decent paying jobs, their poverty, they reduce the poverty of themselves, because they can afford to get, their children can now go to school if they need to pay a little bit. They can buy better facilities for their children, running water, electricity. You start living a better life, having a better diet, better food, healthcare. Everything's better when you have wealth, but you create a little bit of wealth, people get out of poverty. So people need jobs or self-employment. If they can't get a job and they can't get self-employment, then they're going to stay in poverty for many, many generations. And this is why people give up. And a lot of people in rural areas end up not going to school because they think, what's the point of going to school? Because it's a waste of time because I can't get a good job. There's no self-employment. So I might as well just work on my mom's farm or just work on the land and just help my parents to make a little bit of money. But if you can go to school and get a decent job, there's an incentive for you to say, right, we'll help my children to go to university so they don't have to do basic subsistence farming. They can go and get a job in the city or a bank or somewhere, get a better paid job or a skill or a trade and earn more money and help the family that way. Because you can't beat an income either from business or job to get your family out of poverty. That's why there's so much remittance to African countries and poorer countries around the world. And remittance just means people who are Ethiopian, who live in Britain, America, etc., in other countries, send a lot of money home to their families because they're in employment or they're in a business. And because they're in employment or business and they're earning more money, they can afford to send some of that money back home. And that money back home really helps the economy back home. So it's a really important part. Right, let's go through these. We've only got 10 minutes left. Right, so the government has announced a huge amount of external investment, $9 billion as a reform package. So that's a lot of money they're attracting there. And the main pillars of the economic reform include macroeconomic, structural and sector policies. So what all that means is macro and microeconomic. Macroeconomic is big picture thinking, looking at the reform of the economy as a whole. So that's looking at telecoms, looking at the banking structure. That's macroeconomic. Microeconomic is looking at small business and local areas, that kind of micro looking at it. And the macro is looking at the big economy. So that's why they're looking at structural changes as well as sector policies like tourism, encouraging finished goods, more manufacturing, etc. So one of the biggest producers of shoes is Ethiopia. A Chinese company employs 60,000 Ethiopians making shoes. So it's really quite major. There's a heated debate still in the country around this issue. So I'm not saying it's all straightforward. There's still a dispute about what's right and what's not, what priorities, what the reform package should be. So there's lots of debate in the country about that. And regional development is not enough mentioned. And so that's part of the problem. If you don't do regional development, you'll fuel the ethnic tensions. You see, if I don't look after my regions and I'm the prime minister, people start getting suspicious and say, the reason why Asari is not helping this region because his people don't live in it. And this is what fuels the problems, because the leaders in those areas will say, yeah, Asari is not giving us resources because he's not one of us. And this creates a lot of tension and hatred that leads to deaths and murdering people. This is what created problems in Kenya when they had the elections and they were killing Muslims and killing each other because people who lived together for years suddenly became their enemies and war on each other. This came from Ethiopian News and Views. That's where I got that from. So let's look at the role of women. Let's finish off these slides before we finish. Ethiopian, this is stats from Ethiopian government themselves. Nearly 25% of women leave most decisions to their husbands. So there's still this sexist relationship, yeah, that they still think their husband should rule their homes and make all the decisions. Look at this, almost 50% of women, this is the government saying this, almost 50% of women in Ethiopia have experienced violence from their husbands. So this is a real problem, and their partners. So that's not just husbands, that's partners. Less than 20% of girls enroll for secondary education. So by the time girls reach 11, 80% are not going to school. So that's a massive problem. So you can see how this becomes a structural problem, because if 80% of girls are not going to secondary education, that means 80% of women have not gone to secondary education. It means they can't go to college, they're not going to university, they're not going to get certain jobs, they're not going to be in engineering, they're not going to be in the typical male employed areas, and therefore they're going to be dependent on their husbands, and they can't earn as much money, so they become more dependent. So this is a cycle. If you get women more educated, girls going to school, and girls more educated, they can become surgeons, doctors, and do the trades, own businesses, and they can be more independent. And then you have women as a stronger voice in society, and men can't exploit them as easily when women have more equal roles. So it's very important. And then 40% are married by the time they're 18. So again, if you're married by the time you're 18, again, you're under the thumb of a man. Because I bet you most of them aren't marrying another young person. They're marrying an older man. So this is another problem with repression, because again, you haven't even finished developing. You know, you're 18 years old, you're already married, you start having children, you're not really building a career, you're not independent of your husband, you're totally tied to the family. If you look at countries that have educated their girls, women who are educated have children younger. That's a fact. Anywhere in the world, you look at the stats, anywhere in the world, you look at countries where women are educated in higher proportions, they put off childbirth because they want to put off the families, because they want to develop their jobs, their career, or they want to develop a business. So they have children later. So they're more developed. They have more money. By the time they have children, they have more wealth. So it makes the whole family more out of poverty. If you're having children by the time you're 18 and you haven't even got a job, you're not educated, you just stay in poverty. And how do you get yourself out of it? You've got 2 or 3 children by the time you're 25. You've got no education. How do you get yourself out of that cycle of poverty? And this is how countries are not developing if we don't look at this. So we really need to look at these issues. And anybody wants to give me a speech about population growth in Africa, I'll take you on that one as well. Because having uncontrolled population growth in Africa is not helping us. If we just have loads and loads of children and don't have any money to feed them, we're just creating more poverty for ourselves. So we need to have childbirth control, and we need to think about the best birth control is not birth control. The best birth control is young women going to university, going to college, getting good jobs and opening businesses, because those women will put off having children and have more control over their childbirth. So they will automatically have less children. If you want to have massive poverty, don't educate girls, don't give them education, don't give them access to good jobs, and they have loads of children because men want to have loads of children with them, leave them under their control, and then you just have this cycle of poverty. 50% of our population not being productive and economically productive and being their best potential is not helping our people develop. So we need our women to be side by side with us men and taking on these major roles. Let Bill Gates kill our babies. Well, we've got to be careful with these conspiracy theories. I'm not pro or against Bill Gates, but I want evidence. I've seen lots of allegations about Bill Gates. I've seen very little evidence, but I'm not getting into that debate tonight. But we have to be careful about, I'm not talking about birth control through vaccinations and all those things. I'm talking about doing it organically by educating women and girls so they will want less children and want to bring up their children with more happiness and better conditions. Because no woman who gets to 25 is just going to want a whole load of children and just let that happen so easily as somebody who's 17, 16, 15, who's got no say. If a child's married at 15, they're not going to tell their husband they don't want a child. So this is really an issue. I see that, but YouTube video doesn't prove anything to me. So I understand that, but we can argue about this all day. YouTube videos saying that somebody did something is not enough evidence, because you can get another YouTube video saying somebody didn't do it. So I'm just cautious of lots of the stuff going on social media at the moment about this whole thing about the vaccines and that. I think we've got to be very careful. If we look at the evidence around vaccines, there are millions of people around the world who have benefited from vaccines. So it's not to say some vaccines aren't a problem, and it's not to say some Africans haven't suffered during vaccines. That's not my point. It's like guns. I'm not against guns. I'm against people shooting people for no reason. I'm not against guns on principle. So we have to be really careful when we're against vaccinations. Are we against all vaccinations, or are we only against some vaccinations? We have to be really careful there. We don't throw the baby out with the bathwater and we start saying we're against things when Africa had the first medicines in the world. We gave ourselves medicines, Africa, before any European, anybody else came. So some people won't even take a headache tablet, and Africans had headache tablets before Europeans ever came to Africa. So we have to be careful what we argue and what we say around some of these issues. So I'm just being cautious about it. Like we're running out of time, so I'm going to have to, let's speed up and finish off this these couple of slides, and then we're done. So look at this, Ethiopia and Rwanda, I mentioned that before. The Yellow Movement, which is campaigns for women's rights. This was on the BBC. We have never seen women in power like this. it is new to our eyes. Whatever the post, it is great move to develop women's leadership. So you see how symbolic it is? Women who are 50% of the leadership. What does it tell young children? What woman, any child or woman in Ethiopia today, seeing half the cabinet as women, seeing the president as a woman, is encouraging you for a different way of thinking. So it's really important. Right, let's finish off these. This is just another slide. Gender disparity in Ethiopia. See, so look at education. See, look at women and education disparities in Ethiopia. How many people dropping out of school? This is a problem with how many people are in school. So no education. Is much more girls not getting educated than boys. Still 25% of boys not getting education, but it's nearly 50% of girls not getting education. It's way too high. Look at employment. 30% of women employed, nearly 90% of men employed. That's a big disparity. Internet's a bit more balanced, as you can see there. So it's not so much a problem with internet. That's probably because most of the people with internet are middle class. So that's probably why it's a bit more balanced there. Just some quick pictures. Have we ever seen these images of Ethiopia? When we see pictures of Ethiopia through all these charities and Eurocentric charities, they always show people with looking poor and decrepit. When we don't see these images, look at this factory down here. Absolutely thousands in a factory. That's the shoe factory. I think that's the shoe factory that's down there on the left. Here's light rail. On the bottom left is light rail that came into Ethiopia not long ago. Very modern transit system. Here's some modern houses in the top right-hand corner. And on the bottom, on the top left, a modern city in Ethiopia. So I just wanted to show you that quick contrast. Modern Ethiopia. So this is just before the COVID. This is some of the economic growth. Fantastic economic growth, 7.8% to 9%. That was the growth anticipated up to 2023. And that Ethiopia could become a middle income country by 2025. Yeah, so this is just some of the examples I just wanted to share with you to understand. This is some of the industries they want, the major industries in Ethiopia: agriculture, construction, manufacturing. Manufacturing, I told you how important that is, but construction is also important. All of these important. If you don't have the energy and the resources, then you don't have the infrastructure for the businesses to flourish. Tourism is a major foreign income earner, so very important to most countries. And food processing means that you're producing the food into finished goods that you can sell in tins and other things so you can make more money. So let me just finish, because I know people will start dropping off. That's one of the massive industrial parks I mentioned before, and the only park in Africa exclusively to the manufacture of textiles and apparel. That's where the shoes are and all that stuff. So modern Ethiopia, just a few more slides. You know, Ethiopian Airlines, the best airline in Africa in 2017. Ethiopian Airlines, the largest fleet in Africa. And the European Council named Ethiopia as the world's best tourism destination in 2015. Another part of Ethiopia we don't experience. One day I'm going to get on one of these planes. And just look at this, fastest growing economy. Just some other slides here. Sorry, I'm going over, so I'm just jumping through these. This is just reinforcing what I've said anyway around the changes in the Ethiopian economy. All right, so I'll just put up some more data. Foreign direct investment has gone up massively. It's now 3% of the economy, 3 billion in 2018, but it was on decline at the time. And reduced economic activity does increase job losses, and the post-COVID situation is going to be a problem, but they're investing 1.6 billion in emergency rescue plan. So there is light at the end of the tunnel. They're still expecting the economy to grow later this year, but it will only probably grow by about 3%. Okay. I haven't got time to get into the Grand Ethiopian Dam, but this is a major thing. Look it up on the internet. Ethiopia has built this dam over many, many years, but it's now in dispute with Sudan and Egypt, threatening potential war over it, because Ethiopia want to now put water into the dam, and that's going to drain massive amount of water from the Nile, which is what feeds Egypt and Sudan. So there's a big, big, big issue about this at the moment, and it could fuel massive electricity for the whole of Ethiopia, to the point they can actually export the electricity. 65% of Ethiopians don't have electricity right now. So it's really important that we get this dam finished and we get the water into the dam and create the electricity that Ethiopia needs. It's really, really quite a major issue right now, this whole dam. This is just a bit of history of the dispute in the world's longest river. And it's taken 5 years. It will take 5 years to fill the dam. That's how big it is. The dam is bigger than the whole of Greater London. It's hard to even conceptualize how big that is. So that's why it takes 5 years to fill. How long does it take you to fill your bath? I think if it takes 5 years to fill it, that tells you about the huge amount of water that's going to be needed. That's why Sudan and Egypt are raising concerns about it. But I'm sure they can come to an agreement of how they can make that work for them. There's enough technology now to make that work. This is just a little bit about incomes. As I showed you before, incomes in Ethiopia are very, very low. Very, very low indeed. Look at the average income. Average salary is $300 a month. That's for people who are salaried. Remember, most people aren't even having a salary. So out of those who do, it's very, very low. It's hardly risen between 1981 and 2018. Over that long period of time, nearly 40 years, hardly any increase in income. And that's what I'm saying about the economy. If you don't increase the income of the people, they just stay poor because world's prices have gone up. Things around the world have gone up in price. And if people's income aren't going up, you can't get them out of poverty. It's very important. Look at the minimum wage. The sort of perceived, because there isn't actually a minimum wage in Ethiopia. All right, there's no minimum wage, but the perceived, what's sort of informally agreed, is only $75 a month. How many people can live on $75 a month? That is real poverty income. Okay, that's the source there. This is the World Bank and the minimum wage organization. Healthcare is one of the worst in the world. It's ranked pretty poor in the world, and healthcare, well, it's actually ranked reasonably well considering how poor Ethiopia is, but the score is still very low out of 100, only 40 out of 100. A very high number of, very low number of hospital beds and doctors per person. Only 30% of health facilities have improved water sources. So 70% of healthcare doesn't have proper water facilities. It's really a problem, all right? Improvements are particularly necessary in that sector, so they're doing a lot to try and do that. So this is just an example of some of the things. But look at that. Given that Ethiopia has 110 million people, 50 million more than Britain. Britain's had 44,000 deaths of COVID and growing. Ethiopia's only had 7. It's unbelievable how many deaths in Britain compared to countries like this. Very quickly, just look at education. I spoke to you before about this. They do speak local languages in the education system, so that's encouraged, which is good. But the levels of enrollment and levels of finishing school is still poor. And the lack of water and working toilets is a big problem in the infrastructure. And literacy is still very low. So a very large percentage of Ethiopians are illiterate in their own languages and in foreign language. So that's a real problem with the growth of the economy. They've got to get something done about education, otherwise the economy won't grow very well. Got a quick question. Who owns the land in Ethiopia? Is it nationalized? I think it is. I'm not 100% sure. It's a good question, but I'm not 100% sure. I believe the land is predominantly owned by the state. I could be wrong about that though, but I believe it is, given the history. So housing is also poor and really a problem. Most people live in pretty poor accommodation. Look at that. Only 20% of the population have access to adequate sanitation. 63% are using shared pits to use the toilet. I mean, it really is a problem. Yeah, only 30% of the stock of housing is in decent condition. Access to clean drinking water in the countryside is only half the people. This is just some pictures of, let me just go back. Any questions before we finish? Let me just show you the last slide. That's the last slide. Modern Ethiopia. Sorry, I went over time. I didn't realize how much material I had. I wanted to give you full value. Thanks for those who stayed on. And I'll stay on for a little bit longer just to get a few questions. Any questions anybody wants to ask, I'll take them now.